All right. Welcome again, everyone. I'm Gabriel Weintraub. I'm a faculty member at Stanford GSB at the Graduate School of Business. It's a real pleasure to be here at the HAI Weekly Seminar. And we have a really distinguished speaker today, Professor Harikesh Nair. Harikesh is the Jonathan Lovelace Professor of Marketing. He works in marketing analytics and computational social science. So his research brings together social science theory, statistical tools, and marketing data to better understand, on one hand, consumer behavior, and also, on the other hand, improve strategic marketing decisions of firms. Harikesh will be talking today about digital advertising and the golden age of experiments. And he's a world leading expert in research and also in industry in these topics. It's hard to think of anyone better to tell us about this. So without further ado, please, Harikesh, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that very nice introduction. Let me start off by also thanking HAI for the opportunity, and it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. Before I start, I also want to thank my co-authors, from whom I have learned so much, and with whom several of the papers I'm going to talk about are written, and also my colleagues at JD.com, which is an e-commerce company based in China that I work with quite a bit, where a lot of the products that I'm going to talk about today are actually deployed. HAI was also very kind to share with me some of the profiles of the people in the audience, and it was very varied. There are lots of professors and faculty and students from campus and beyond, and also people from industry across a wide range of functional areas, including product managers all the way to founders and CEOs. So I'm going to keep things very general, but I'm going to presume some knowledge of advertising and some knowledge of experiments because you guys are here. So let's get the conversation started. Would love to talk to you more about this. So think of it as a conversation, and happy to do the Q&A. So just to dive deep into the topic, as you understand, advertising is a key business function, and it's really the lifeblood of a lot of internet monetization. Now, if you think about the advertising problem from a firm's perspective, it's actually pretty complicated because there is incredible amounts of uncertainty. What is the effect of advertising, which I mean efficacy? What kind of creative should I use? Who should I show it to, target audiences? How much should I bid on advertising auctions? How should I manage budget? And in the face of this incredible uncertainty, especially in modern times, experimentation as a device becomes very attractive in order to resolve uncertainty and make decisions. Now, what's incredible for people like us sitting in academia is that experiments were really something that scientists did and to solve scientific problems. But if you look at digital advertising today, it's really exciting and very incredible that this tool has become so pervasive that the advertising industry is now going through a golden age of experimentation, not just for ads, but for business experiments as a whole. It's remarkable that businesses are adopting experimentation in such a sustained fashion. And so today I want to give you a feel for how ad experiments work, and then also a feel for how ad experiments differ from typical natural science counterparts. Okay. I also want to tell you a little bit about how modern ad experimentation systems look very different from their old counterparts. If you look on the left, when advertising was all offline, this is 20 years back, there were rarely experiments, and these were mass production systems. You had to set up a lot of stuff in order to get an experiment off the ground. And then when digital ads came by, the first generation, you could think of them as one-off experiments, mostly done by firms here in Silicon Valley, to measure the effect of advertising. So they were measurement-based and one-off based. But this is not how modern advertising and experimentation systems look. These experimentation systems are engineered products. They are encoded into the ad server, if you will, and they are automation tools that incorporate very nicely experimentation with modern machine learning. So I want to talk about this piece and explain why it makes sense. And products like these are available at many of the tech companies and ad platforms here on the left. but I'm going to describe mostly some of the products that I helped build along with my team at JD.com, which is an e-commerce company based in China that I spent a fair amount of time with. Okay, so let's get started. Just to set expectations and terminology here, by experiment, I mean an approach that uses randomization across units to reduce uncertainty. Units could be across human beings, across geographies, across firms, etc. But typically, we'll think about consumers or users. And when I say experimental design, I mean, how are these units allocated? How are these units randomized and who's assigned what? Assigned means who gets what ad or whatnot. Okay, so with that terminology, the first thing to establish here as to why ad experiments look a little different from natural science experiments is about the objectives of running the experiment. Okay, recall these are business experiments. So if you think about the typical natural science experiment, I mean typical, there are obviously exceptions. The main goal is measurement. For example, I might be a biologist. I might want to understand how consumption of drugs affects organisms, and I might randomize mice who are the units of the experiment. Some mice get some dosage of a particular drug, let's say a vice drug like heroin, and then some others don't, and I kind of measure the effect of heroin dosage. Or if I am in medicine, I might try to understand what dosage of a particular drug should I prescribe, and some patients who are the units in the experiment will get one dosage and others will not get that dosage, but might get a smaller dosage or even a placebo. And actually, the first generation of ad experiments also worked this way. They would randomize units or consumers into different types of ads to measure what is the effect of that ad. Okay, so it's measurement as the goal. Now, when we started taking those ideas and converting them into engineered systems that actually work within modern ad systems, what we generally found, and this was our experience at JD as well, is you get this DAO reaction from the brand or the advertisers. There might be one or two firms that are using it, but the adoption of the product in which experimentation is engineered does not scale. And the reason, if you think about it, is kind of obvious for people who work in actual businesses, is that measurement is not an end in itself for a firm. Okay, and the typical reaction is, that's awesome that the average treatment effect of advertising is 2.3, but now what do I do with that information? Tell me what to do with it. Okay, so measurement is not an end in itself like a typical science experiment. And in a business experiment, in order for the product to be successful, okay, you have to link it extricably, okay, with a decision that is of importance. In other words, the firm is running this experiment in order to have a decision, and that decision in the advertising setting might be, I got to decide what creative or media to show in my ad campaign, or what target audience to choose, or how I should bid in an auction, how I should set budget or do budget optimization. And you need to link the experiment and the measurement very closely with that action. Otherwise, it's very hard to scale this up. So that's why I want you guys to remember that the reason that ad experiments are very policy driven, they're very closely linked to actions. And that determines the second point about ad experiments. One thing that's important to keep in mind is, in typical science, we design the experiment, which is the experimental design, what proportion of units get treatment and what proportion get control, from a trade-off between type 1 and type 2 error. It's from a perspective of hypothesis testing. But in ad experiments, because they have a clear objective, because the firm is doing this in order to achieve something, we need to link the goals of the experiment very closely with the payoff and the profit goals of the advertiser. So another distinguishing feature of modern ad experiments is that they will be linked very closely to what is the goal from the advertiser or the brand who's running the experiment. In other words, I'm just saying that these experiments are payoff relevant for those who like to think of this in economic terms. For example, I want to think about the firm trying to decide what creative to show, and then I want to think about the goal as engagement. I want to link the experimental design to engagement. Or the firm might be interested in maximizing profits, and I want to think about what is a good design so as to maximize profits while achieving the goals of the advertiser. So here's an example of that. It's a product that we built at JD, which is currently in deployment for a year and a half now. It's called Comparison Lift. And the goal here, the advertiser or the brand is designing a marketing campaign, and she wants to figure out what creative or what kind of image to show in the brand and what kind of target audience to show. So we built an ad experimentation product to support this, and it's currently online. The JD ad system, for those who can read Mandarin, it's Jinzhongtong or jzt.jd.com, and it's under production there. And part of the reason we built the product was we would notice that there is revealed demand for experimentation by advertisers. There'll be some advertisers who will run the same campaign for the same target audience, but use different types of creatives simultaneously. And that showed us that advertisers would like to learn using real data what works, and we built this product for them. And here is a plot on the y-axis of the number of experiments that have run in the first year of the product's deployment. That is May 2019 to 20. And you can see roughly 120 experiments are being initiated by firms per month. That's on the order of, just for this narrowly defined problem, of the order of about 4 to 5 per day. So there's like a massive demand for uncertainty reduction by firms, and some of these data are described in a paper that I will just show you. So how do these things work? Let's take an example. Imagine I'm a company that works that's interested in advertising on this e-commerce platform, let's say Samsung, selling phones, and I have two possible target audiences: users who browse the Samsung store on JD, which is like Amazon, in the last 15 days, and users who, another target audience is, from showing my campaign, users who browse the Samsung store on JD in the last 15 days and added a cell phone to their cart on the e-commerce app. So the second is like a retargeted audience. And I have 3 possible creatives or images to show in the campaign that I would run. So there are 2 possible target audiences and 3 possible creatives. So there are 6 possible target audience combinations and creative combinations to choose from. And my goal is to figure out which one of these 6 should I choose for my marketing campaign. Okay, and there is uncertainty. So the advertiser will use our product to resolve this uncertainty by logging into the self-served automated ad experimentation product that we built. So this is how it would work. The advertiser would log in. She would upload the creatives she wants to test, those 3. Okay, it could be a video, it could be an image, anything. She can choose target audiences. On modern ad systems, you can create thousands of target audiences, choose from thousands of target audiences, choose a campaign goal. And this is what I mean by linking it to goals. There is a particular goal that the advertiser or the brand has from running this campaign: maximize clicks, maximize visits, maximize conversion, maximize GMV or gross merchandising value. And then the advertiser would click go, and then we would run the experiment for the advertiser, encoded into the complex ad auction system in the background, and then we would automate the whole process. So here's a screenshot from the app, or the mobile app, where almost all the traffic goes, especially in parts of Asia, such as China. And the top part at the top where the arrow points to is an ad. And then what we would do is, as users load the app, we would randomly show different types of creatives, one of those 3, through those users. Okay, and that's the experiment. And then we would randomize the creatives to these users and start learning which is working well in terms of progress towards the goal that the advertiser says she cares about. If it's clicks, that would be the goal. And then here's the fun part. As data are arriving sequentially, as we learn during this experiment that we are running on behalf of the advertiser, that one creative is doing well, we will decide, well, there is not much need to keep on allocating more and more traffic to creatives that have been learned to be not as good for the advertiser. So we will adapt the experimental design, which means, by adapting, I mean changing the allocation of traffic to some of the arms based on what is performing so well so far. But we won't shut down experimentation. It could be some of the other arms are still worthwhile checking out. So we will allocate some traffic to some of the other arms or other creatives, but bulk of the traffic would be allocated to the creative or image that is doing well so far. And in that way, we will protect the advertiser's interests and reduce the costs of experimentation to the advertiser. So an adaptive design engineered into the product is actually key to how the entire experiment works. For example, if the target audience 1 and that image combination is doing better on the experiment than target audience 2 and that combination, we will start allocating more traffic to this. So that's the key to why the experimentation works. We have fused the experimental design, which is which creative gets more traffic or user impressions, to the goals of the advertiser, which is I want to figure out what is the right creative and then get some payoff from that. By fusing that and adapting the experimental design to what I'm learning in the experiment, as an engineered product, I protect the advertiser's interest and deliver value to the advertiser, and therefore demand for the product remains high. And the way we would do it is using modern machine learning algorithms such as contextual bandits, which people in the audience may be familiar with. And the contextual bandits will deliver on this goal. And we have papers in the public domain for those who are interested in getting into it in a little bit of more depth. And the paper on the left with my incredible colleagues, Tong and Shiliang, talks about the algorithm, and the paper on the right will describe some of the production and the deployment process and the engineering infrastructure that is required for having bandit-based experiments done at scale within a real organization. So hopefully that gave you a bit of a feel for how an experimentation can be converted into a scalable product, and how that product can be implemented in a way such that the goals of the experimentation is not just simply measurement, but it's linked to an action and is linked to the goals of an advertiser. Okay, so let's move to topic number 2. Another reason that modern ad experiments are a bit different from typical experiments is that they are dynamic rather than static experimental design. What do I mean by that? The environment of a modern ad platform is very dynamic and it's constantly changing. And as information is coming through sequentially, we want to exploit it, just like we saw in the comparison lift experiment that we just discussed. Okay, so we want to utilize that. And that's a different paradigm from the old paradigm. In the old paradigm for experimentation, typically there would be a phase called planning. We would plan the experiment, then we would run the experiment, and then we will take some actions such as, figure out what exactly to show, what creative to show, how to bid, etc., based on what we learned in the planning phase and the running phase. We can characterize this as an explore phase and a distinct exploitation of the information called the exploit phase. Okay, and they are distinct phases. But in modern digital markets, experimentation and exploitation of that information happens simultaneously rather than sequentially. And this is very useful perspective to keep in mind for those who are working from the advertiser side or from the firm side. There is no such thing as experiment and take action. They both work well together. And the two phases, exploit and explore, have fused together. And then you have to have a mindset of continuous experimentation. In modern ad systems, what's happening is we're continually experimenting. And as we learn during the experiment that certain actions are beneficial, we start taking those actions in real time. But the reason we called an action beneficial was based on your goals, which is your objective for running the campaign. The advertiser is also protected because we are taking actions that are consistent with the goals of the advertiser, while at the same time running exploration. So in that sense, AI methods such as bandits are very, very helpful and have a lot of intuitive appeal for modern experimentation systems. And when you fuse bandits with technology-driven engineered products, you get a very powerful combination, and also respecting the traditional considerations and statistics of causality. So the causal AI here is actually very exciting for scientists, and this is how you should think about modern ad systems. That also demands a mindset change for advertisers from no experiments to one-off experiments to the modern world of continuous experimentation. There is no real need to shut down experimentation because while some exploration is happening, you are getting traffic that is allocated to the option that is best from maximization of your stated goals. And in that sense, there is a very happy marriage between experimentation and exploitation, and there is no need for shutting down experimentation at all. In fact, the environment on many ad systems are now characterized by continuous and pervasive experimentation. A third reason, just to shift gears a little bit more, is to expound a little bit more on the environment of continuous experimentation. So I told you one reason for continuous experimentation is that the environment is characterized by sequential arrival of information. As information arrives, you want to update, and you want to update and use that information as soon as it is useful in a manner that is helpful for me. The other reason is you should think of advertising and ad effects not as a number that exists in the natural world, but as an equilibrium object. Okay, that is coming out of the interactions of a complex sets of agents, including human beings and firms, within a complex market such as a platform. Okay, and if you think of it as an equilibrium object, which requires some economic thinking to be fused with experimentation and statistics, you will see that there is actually no such thing as the effect of the ad or the causal effect of the ad. It really depends on the competitive environment on the platform, what other advertisers are doing. And because the competition could change quite dramatically, the effect of the ad would also change dramatically, and therefore you may want to consider continuous experimentation. And it's all linked to how the control group works, and I'll give you an example in just a second. But this is actually very different from, say, a biology experiment or a medicine experiment, where the control group in the experiment is typically a placebo, and it's a fixed placebo against which I want to measure the effect of the treatment or the option that I'm evaluating. Okay, so let's think about what I mean by this. And I want to take an example of an experiment in which I want to measure the causal or the true or the incremental effect of an advertising campaign. And where I'm going with this is I will also make a case for why you want experimentation systems to be developed by the platform and not necessarily by the advertiser, which is a bit of a controversial view, but it's my view. I'm going to stick with it. Okay. All right. So let's think about what I want to do when I'm measuring the effect of an advertiser or brand A's advertising. Okay. And the way I want to think about it is that it's really a comparison of two worlds. On the left is a world where A is advertising, and on the right is a world where A is not advertising. Okay, and I want to think about how users will behave when A is advertising versus how users will behave when A is not advertising, and that's what I'm trying to simulate using an experiment. Experiments are simulators of worlds. On the left is the test group, which is randomly shown ads, so it simulates a world where A is advertising. On the right is the control group, in which users are not shown A, and it simulates a world in which A is not advertising. So now the question is, and I'm going to give some names to these worlds. The factual world is where A is advertising on the left, that's the test group. And the counterfactual world is, I'm thinking in my mind, what will happen to all these users if I were not advertising? That's the counterfactual world. It's an imagined reality that I'm trying to simulate. All right, so now it's obvious that the factual world, when I'm advertising, I should show users my ad. But the question arises in the counterfactual world where when I'm not advertising, what should users see? What should the control group see? And if you think about what happens on high traffic positions, and the jargon in the ad tech world is this is like ad inventory. This is a slot on which ad is shown. Take a slot on the homepage of an Amazon app or a JD app in this case. And the top banner, that slot, is reserved for advertising. Excuse me. And imagine A is thinking of advertising here. Now, I got to imagine that if I'm not advertising, what would happen there? Well, if I'm not advertising, because there's competition for that ad slot, especially on the homepage of a high demand app like JD, there are 100 other advertisers that are trying to advertise on that slot. So if A is not advertising, some other advertiser's ad would be shown there. So users would see some other advertiser's ad, and that ad, let's call that ad B. And therefore, we understand that the counterfactual ad, which is the ad that users would see and respond to if I were not advertising, is not no ads. It's actually the ad B, which is an ad that the users would actually see. So that means that I should allocate users in the test group ad A, which I want to evaluate, and users in the control group should see another ad, not no ads or a placebo. It should see another ad. And that's the right control that is compatible with the measurement of the ad effects in equilibrium competition. Now, what is that other ad? Okay, that's important to get that other ad right. Otherwise, you're not measuring an equilibrium construct, the right effect of A's advertising. So now, how do we figure that out? Okay, and this is how we would figure it out, and this is how some of the products that we have built and others have built at other companies work. Okay, now as the ad platform, if A, B, C, D, all of these guys want to advertise at that ad slot to that user impression, I got to figure out a way to resolve that competition. And as people know, the modern way in which competition is resolved is using an auction. Now, if I'm the ad platform and I work at JD, I can see the auction logs, and I can see that in that auction that A won, B was the second highest bidder in that auction, and C was the third highest bidder or whatnot. So I know that if A was not advertising, then the users would be seeing B, okay? And I know what B is because I can observe the auction logs at scale across millions and millions of auctions. And therefore, I have a way of figuring out what the control group should do. So good experimental design will show the test group A, and it will show the control group B. Okay, so exactly the identity of B, the counterfactual, is now can be read off the auction logs. If you understand that perspective, again, you're thinking about why this makes sense. It makes sense because the effect of advertising really depends on the competitive environment. The identity B is dependent on which other competitors are interested in advertising to the same user that I am interested in advertising to. All right, and it's really critical in order to measure this correctly to get the identity of B correctly. But let's make 2 points. So what is the effect of the advertising? It's on average, how do users behave when they see A versus how, on average, how users see when they see the competing counterfactual ad. And therefore, by just extending that logic further, when competition changes on the platform, the identity of B will change, and therefore the effect of the ad will also change. Okay, and therefore there is no such thing as the effect of the ad. It's a construct that is coming out of the equilibrium competition on the marketplace, and therefore you may want to do experimentation continuously because this effect is changing over time, and you may want to capture that and take actions against that. So that's making a case for continuous experimentation. That's one. Now let me make a case for why you may want to allow this to be done by the platform. And this is why you find that modern experimentation systems are engineered systems by platforms. And that's the reason is that, the identity of B, the counterfactual ad, really varies from auction to auction. In one auction for males in Palo Alto, maybe B is Apple. In another auction for males who have iPhones and who are logging in at 5 p.m. in Palo Alto, the identity of B might be HP. So it varies from auction to auction. And, for each auction, you have to understand what exactly that counterfactual ad is. And I can do that if I observe the ad queue. Yes. And if I need to observe the ad queue across millions of auctions, I need to be able to ping the ad server in real time and run this experiment without it introducing unnecessary latency into the ad serving problem. Otherwise, I can lose millions of dollars. Okay. So both of these can be done more logically by the platform and not the advertiser. The advertiser does not observe the ad auction logs, and incorporating this into the ad server and building the data pipelines in the background in a low latency situation is better done at the platform. And that's why there's a strong case for the experimentation to be built as an engineered product by the platform. Okay. A final reason for why modern ad systems look very different from natural science experiments and why you are seeing an evolution of experimentation being provided as a product or a service by the platform is because there is a desired business goal from running the experiment on the left, and then there are measurable results in terms of how it affected the bottom line or the top line of a brand or a company on the right. And then the experimentation system is something that lies in between. And the real challenge in a practical setting, when you actually sit down and start to deploy something like this, is how to close that gap. And there is a huge amount of work involved in moving from left to right for those who are actually doing this in practice. There are at least 4 different stages. You have to define the problem in math. You got to think about the algorithm. Then you got to build the data pipelines, and then you got to put the product into production. And each of these are scientifically demanding tasks. When you think about the problem definition, you got to take the problem defined in business terms and convert that into precise mathematical statements. And as the old saying goes, the solution is only as good as the KPI. We have to think about what is the objective, as I mentioned, was very important for the advertiser or for the brand from running this experiment. And we got to formulate the objective, the key performance indexes in mathematical terms. I got to decide whether the bandit should be a regret minimization algorithm or a best time algorithm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that requires a science team to think very deeply about this in an atmosphere of gray or uncertainty. Then I got to build algorithms. And one of the challenges is that the algorithms have to deliver on the action and move me closer to my goal. But at the same time, I also need to do good statistical inference, such as getting standard errors and confidence intervals and things like that. So I have to think about the statistical inference problem associated with machine learning, on which not much is still known. We are still in the early days of that. And then I got to fuse my machine learning assumptions with economic assumptions about the objectives and optimization. And therefore, often the algorithms are not off the shelf. We need to think about customizing them. The issue of data is a very complex one. Certain metrics are very hard to optimize against. For example, on e-commerce platforms, several e-commerce platforms, conversion is a rare event. And therefore, the statistical noise associated with optimizing conversion is very hard. Oftentimes, only the platform can track conversion. You need tracking systems happening. And even after trackability is possible, because you could insert a pixel on the conversion page or whatnot, you still have to pipeline the entire thing so that the data are collected in real time, loaded onto the logs appropriately, and also matched against user identity and things like that in a way that doesn't break the system. And remember, you would like this to happen without human intervention. So that requires good engineering in order to do the pipelining and the loading of data. Production requires a whole range of new tasks coming up. Bandits in general are actually much more demanding than other algorithms to put into production, because it's a real-time system. And you have to update the experimental design. You got to update how much traffic you're allocating to different creatives or to different arms based on what is happening in real time. So you have to build real-time processing systems without introducing latency. You also have to decide how much of the updating or the model training will happen on the client device, which is on the cell phone usually, as opposed to offline on your own server overnight. And as you do training on the edge, you're really worried about latency. So you got to fix that problem properly. Otherwise, you cannot implement the experiment in real time. How will this interact with other aspects of the ad server, which is on the top, ad server encoding? And then, it's not use it and forget it. It has to be tested and maintained over time, and you need teams to do that. So all of that stuff has to be built out to move from the desired business goal on the left to the desired measured result on the right. And that's not easy. And the frank reality right now is that tech and platforms are better equipped to do this than typical advertisers and brands. And therefore, there's a strong case, at least in my mind, for experimentation to be provided as a platform product. It's got its pluses and minuses, but there's a strong case for this to be delivered as a platform product, and not something that that an external advertiser could do there, even though there are good ways to think about it that way too. All right. I'm almost towards my end. Let me quickly outline a few open problems in the area for those who became interested in the topic and who are actually a little bit more deep in the topic and thinking about where the entire space is going. One issue is that it's a fool's paradise to believe that you can experiment your way out of every possible situation, because beyond a certain point, experiments still don't scale. So there's still value for better science and engineering to solve that problem. Here's an example, which is called the multi-touch attribution problem, very important for advertising platforms. Imagine that I observed on JD that the user has purchased a product, and I would like to know what cost that purchase. Unfortunately, prior to the purchase, there could be a myriad number of touch points, all of which are ads and non-ad elements, which the user was influenced by in her purchase journey. For example, she could have seen an ad at an external property, saw a banner ad, then another banner ad, done a search on the app, saw another banner ad on the category page, saw another display ad on the SKU detail page, blah, 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 and then cost purchased. So the multi-touch attribution problem is how much of the observed purchase propensity was due to each touch point. And it's really important to figure that out, to figure out how much budget to allocate to each of these touch points. Is search advertising more important, or category homepage banner advertising more important? And if you think about that problem, if you want to solve it by a pure experimentation, what you really need is to randomize users into full sequences of ad positions, because the entire sequence could matter. The effect of the banner ad on the category homepage could depend on what search ad I saw before. So you have to think about sequences of ad positions, and therefore the treatment is a sequence. And unfortunately, that problem does not scale that well. Here's the example from JD, and this is common on many e-commerce apps such as Amazon. Here's a homepage display ad. The user could have seen that. Here's a user searching for an iPhone and seeing a search ad, just like a Google search ad. And then here's a user who has gone to the SKU detail page and seen some recommendation for other ads, for other products. And at least on JD, we have more than 300 different ad positions. So if I can think of all possible sequences, that's 2⁻³ sequences. It's impossible to randomize users into those kinds of high dimensional treatment space. So pure experimentation may not work. Here's an open area to combine experimentation with models. Our solution has been to train an RNN, a deep learning model, in which the sequence is encoded as a feature vector, and then we would train a model of conversion as a function of that sequence, and then use that. And if experimentation is available, we would train the model on the experimental data, thereby fusing experimentation with machine learning and models in this situation. This attribution system is under production, and if people were interested, you could read about it in this publicly available paper. Another interesting question is, now we are confronting a situation where experimentation is not a rare event, but potentially everybody on the platform is experimenting, every firm is experimenting, and potentially every user is experimenting. So you got to think about a situation where, how should I think about what I'm getting from an experiment in an environment where everyone's experimenting? And if you think about A running an experiment, maybe the counterfactual for A is B, and B is also running an experiment. And therefore, this could be interference across experiments. And it's not obvious how to design those systems. So that's an open problem about interference on platforms. There are several people working on that problem. We've found a solution. It's described in a paper. And this is deployed on the JD platform. And we're still learning how to make this work. Another one for those who are watching the space is, as you know, the big platforms are responding to privacy and data tracking in a very important way. And the marketing data landscape is changing quite dramatically. Apple has announced that it will stop allowing apps to collect without user consent the IDFA, or ID for advertisers, which is a unique user ID that will endow an advertiser to understand that this is a particular user. And the advertising industry kind of is reacting to this as an apocalypse, and it's going to happen pretty soon. And Google has announced that third-party cookies will be deprecated in Chrome, the most popular browser. So the implication for people who are interested in experimentation is that I no longer know a unique user, and essentially I'm unable to randomize things at the user ID level. So we had to think about new experimental designs in those kinds of situations. So that's an area where lots of people are trying to think about solutions, and where more science is welcome. And that's actually an important paradigm for the entire industry and for the experimentation systems to go to as well. Closing thoughts. I explained why experimentation is so compelling and why it's provided as products, but there's still a big gap. You see that while really small advertisers who have a lot of uncertainty and brands could adapt the experimentation, you see mostly big firms are doing it. Why is that? Sophistication, personal trust issues, etc. Right? And also you see that the platforms do not fully report almost a lot of what they could report from the experiments. And so it requires a more collaboration between both platforms and firms. Advertisers need to recognize that marketing and modern advertising is not about gut feel and intuition alone. That gut feel and intuition can be sharpened by thinking of it as a data-driven discipline with models and analytics fused, and also demand more of tech. And platforms need to embrace more transparency, report more outcomes, and more granular. And if they are providing experimentation as a service, as products, they should not be black boxes, and they should subject themselves to third-party audits and be clear how they are delivering on advertisers' goals. The area is very interesting for people. It requires fusing economics, statistics, and engineering, and therefore there is a huge gain from productive collaboration between academia and practice, as I hope I was able to demonstrate in the short time that I had with you guys. So I think that's it that I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to comments. And if I'm not able to get to the comments right now, please feel free to email me, and I would be happy to continue the conversation as well. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, Harikesh. That was really great. A lot of great material there. So we have a bunch of questions. Let me start asking you one question. So you talked about continuous experimentation. There's also this more traditional way of experimentation, which is A/B testing, and there you have this. Typically, you have this issue of short-term versus long-term effects. You're running like short-term experiments, but then typically you care about like long-term outcomes. So, do you think having this approach of continuous experimentation alleviates in some way this tension between short-term and long-term outcomes?
Yes, that is a fantastic question, Gabriel, and it actually gets at the heart of what is a fundamental issue for experimentation and for advertisers and for brands, because we know that advertising has long-term effects, and we care about those long-term effects. I think continuous experimentation can get at the long-term effect because I'm holding the control group and then evaluating the treatment, not just for a short period of time, but for long periods of time. But just like static experiments, they also need to be augmented in order to accommodate for that. One of the big issues is delayed feedback. In the approach, the bandit-based approach, which both you and I know, and you have worked in as well, it is important to adapt the experimental design based on information that I'm getting and progress towards the goal. But it could be that the long-term objective, which is how my sales or profits look 6 months down the line, arrives only 6 months later, right? And so I can't adapt in real time. So I need custom methods as to how to adapt the experimental design in order to satisfy long-term objectives. That's an important area. If I can't, then there is not that much difference between an adaptive experiment versus an unadaptive experiment. And one way of doing this would be to think about a surrogate that is a proxy for the long-run outcome. For example, I could build a model between short, high-frequency observed outcomes such as clicks and visits to the SKU page, and then see how predictive that is of the long-run outcome. and then do the adaptation of the experimental design based on the surrogate, while at the same time getting at long run issues as well. And there are issues with what's a good surrogate, how will you deal with censoring in the surrogate and things like that. And now that gets into the realm of science, but it's really an important one. And so the short answer is, yeah, I think continuous experimentation gets at it, but it's got its own tweaks there as well. Yeah, thank you.
Right, thanks. So there's a bunch of good questions here in the chat. So let's start with maybe one more tactical questions, and then we'll ask more like high-level questions. So Thomas is asking, you have, a lot of this, these ads have like very low conversions. They're very noisy. Sometimes you have bots participating. So, how do you deal with like statistical power, and to get like reliable results in your methods? What are your workarounds for that?
No, absolutely. Really good question, and all of those issues are absolutely valid. And the issue of statistical power is an important one, as those in the ads arena know. The causal incremental effect of one ad on a user's outcome in an environment where users are seeing many ads, and there's both macro and micro factors that affect the user's behavior, is actually very small. And when the effect size is small, you need large sample sizes in order to deal with that. So typical variance minimizing methods that I can use in the glorious 100-year history of statistics, we should leverage all of them, right? At one level, we could use covariates in order to pre-experimental covariates to reduce the variance quite dramatically. And a very popular method, which is widely adopted in tech, is the so-called CUPED model, CUPED, in which I think about, I use the same user's pre-experimental behavior as a control, which actually kind of controls for all aspects of outcomes that is unrelated to the ad, for instance. So that would be one strategy, covariate control. Another one would be better experimental design. I might want to use the ghost ad approach, which I won't get into right now, but which is popular now in a lot of tech, by thinking about certain subgroups of users for whom I know the counterfactual very precisely as a way of reducing noise. And then finally, the bandit approach has lots of advantages, because the goal is not as much power, which is the typical goal of the experiment, but the goal is actually, it's okay if I'm not measuring the effect as precisely, but within that environment of uncertainty, I care about how much I'm moving towards my objective. Ultimately, it's okay if I am not measuring each of those things with as much precision as I want, as long as I'm doing better on profits or on revenues as well. So I think if you shift the perspective towards not getting the effect with most power, or lowest mean squared error or whatnot, but towards what's the option that derives highest expected profit, I can actually find in the bandit-based approach that I do much more efficiently, even in low treatment effect environments. So that's a short answer.
Great, thanks. So talking about profits and maybe think about like long-term performance, like Roger is asking, it seems like these methods are very helpful to evaluate. Maybe you have like a small number of discrete choices and you're doing some kind of this local trials, but how about if you want to learn about like deeper insights? Would experimentation help you with that? So for example, how to design good images, not only like what is the best among like these three images, but how to design good images.
Right. Absolutely. Completely agree with that. And that is where we should go to. And that is, I think, a frontier area where a lot of people are working on, where more progress would be welcome. At one level, there are approaches which JD does, and many academic papers have done, and other platforms are working with, where you combine the power of experimentation to explore various possible options with a way of generating new possible options, such as using GANs, or other image or creative generation algorithms. And then the experiments kind of tell you that out of this design space, these options are doing well. And the exploration in the bandit, for instance, will tell you that, hey, put this particular characteristic of the ad or this particular region of the bidding space is actually worth exploring. And then the GAN or your image generation or a generative model can suggest new images or new characteristics that is worth exploring. Then the question is how to efficiently do that, and what exactly would be the objective function for such an algorithm, and what would be rates of convergence, etc., of those algorithms. That's a frontier area. There are many people working on it. I'm not aware of a production quality system that is implemented at scale at a major tech platform that takes that into account, but there are good good academic papers in the machine learning and the social science community that is working on that. And there are some nice startups also working in that. One example would be a company called Persado, which is out there in Chicago, which is doing that with text-based ads and things like that. So very good question. Unfortunately, one of those where we don't have a good answer for you yet. Yes, sorry about that.
Maybe a bit into the future.
Yeah.
Great. So Rachel, switching a bit topic, but also very good question. So how will user data be protected within the bounds of GDPR to ensure that there are no data breaches? And a related question, let me ask both together. And David also is asking, what steps in the tool do you create, if any, to set or measure ethical requirements?
Missed the last part. I understood the GDPR part. What steps did you say?
So the first one was about GDPR, and the second one, David is asking, what steps in the tool do you create, if any, to set or measure ethical requirements?
Yes, this is actually a very, very important point. And as I'm kind of hinted at towards the end in the realm of open issues, it's where the entire industry is moving. As someone famously put it, right now, digital marketing and digital advertising is like a fossil fuel industry. We gorge on data as the fuel, but we have to move to clean tech. And we all understand that we are in the middle of a very important transition, and user data needs to be protected. And we should all be proud that California is a state that has taken a leadership status in that area, and the tech industry is trying its best to follow, for example, the IDFA deprecation move by Apple, and the most recent editorial by Tim Cook in the Wall Street Journal last week explained why it's really important that business as usual, in which we just gorge on the data like this without user consent, without proper informed user consent, is not a sustainable solution for the industry. So I think that it's really important for the tech industry and all of us in academia to work together to solve that problem, and along with policymakers. But in such an environment, the number one issue will be user consent. How exactly to think about consent in a way that is consistent with the user's goals. And then it also eventually will really ultimately depend on society as well. Different societies may have different sensitivities to privacy. And in certain parts of the world, the users might be actually willing to trade data in order for economic benefits. And in some countries, or let's say Germany, which is often quoted as the most privacy-centric country in the world, users may just not be, especially in the rich OECD world. So I think that's an important component. So it'll be varied from country to country. And then the second thing is, in such a situation where there is informed consent, we will have to think about what would be a good way to deliver effective marketing in a way that is consistent with the goals of firms, because advertising and telling people about products and providing information is a fundamental need. And let's face it, a lot of the internet is subsidized by advertising. So how can we sustain that? And at the same time, how can we have good measurement systems and good ways of providing you good and helpful personalization that balances this? I think the regulation will have a very big impact, but I would say that the solution ultimately will have to come from science. We'll have to think about good, better experimental design that does not require user level randomization, but could potentially think about randomization at the level of user characteristics, for instance, as opposed to at the level of user ID. We will have to think about better ways to do experiments using, say, privacy respecting methods such as differential privacy, which is actually a very hot and very powerful framework to think about measurement in situations where I do not need user level data. And we will also have to think about how much user information is required in order to provide effective personalization. And that's an evolving area, but there is no doubt that it's very important. And this is where a lot of smart people are focusing their attention, and the entire tech industry is focusing that attention. So it's already upon us. And so that's my reaction. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Harikesh, for the thought. So we have 2 minutes left. So let me ask one last question, maybe combined question. So how is Jade's this business objective, this is from SAC, aligned with advertisers' business objective, and how is this factor in the model? And then another question is also, how is this also aligned maybe with like a broader societal societal objective?
Right. So it's a complex question there, and it's a really good and very thoughtful question. Thank you for the question. And there are at least 3 entities in the system. There's the platform. Let's say JD as an e-commerce company or Amazon as an e-commerce company. There are the advertisers or the brands that are advertising and selling products and making products available to consumers, and there are users. All right, at least 3 entities. Now the question is, how do I design a system that benefits all? And the general intuition, at least in most platforms, and at least when we design ad systems and ad auctions or whatnot, is that we try to find solutions that maximize the pie, the welfare of all the constituents. Usually, efficient designs will be ones that maximize the surplus of the advertisers and the platform. In the experimentation as service products that I described, the specific ones, let's just comparison lift and some of the other products that I've built, the fundamental belief that drives the development of those products is that this is a service that is provided for the advertiser. And what's good for the advertiser is actually going to be good for us as the platform eventually. So there is usually no interference by the platform as an agency. There is no agency problem, if you will, from the platform side, at least in many of the modern systems that I have seen, and certainly for sure at JD, where I just deliver on the advertiser's goals. And the idea is that that reduces uncertainty for the advertiser, and that makes the advertiser more willing to engage with the platform, and that's eventually good for the ad business as a whole. Finally, I think we also have to be a little careful about the objectives. There is a little bit of a propensity to kind of advise brands as to what their objectives ought to be. The economist in me sometimes tends to get a little preachy by saying, okay, think about the present discounted value of proof of profits and things like that and maximize that. Actually, we should just abandon that approach. And if you see what modern ad systems have done is just get the advertiser to articulate her goals. Your goal is conversion. Well, we'll find an algorithm that maximizes conversion. Your goal is to maximize clicks in the next 6 months. Well, we will deliver a product for that. You want to increase visitation at your product, we will just deliver that. So get the goals from the advertiser. This is what the advertiser, through her own internal vetting process, has decided it makes sense for her. Then design algorithms that just deliver on that in order to help the advertiser. So that's a much more simpler and more viable approach that gets adoption. And then the society level goal, which involves consumer efforts as well, consumer welfare as well, is you don't want to allow ads, or you don't want to have kinds of advertising on the system that is too annoying and reduces consumer welfare. So a fundamental goal of personalization and to keep the ad load limited and to have good transparency in reporting is to make it beneficial for consumers. Hopefully that answered the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Harikesh, for a great talk. Thanks, everyone, all the attendants. Thanks for the great questions. Sorry I didn't have time to go over all of them. So let's wrap up with a virtual clap. And thanks everyone. Good to have you here.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. Thank you to HAI.